role of Prime Minister is no easy job. There's various trips abroad, plenty of meetings to attend, and let's not forget those all-important speeches. But of course, alongside high-profile appearances comes the opportunity for high-profile awkwardness. Cue the recent curtsy lunge for Prince William. So with that in mind, here are 5 of Theresa May's most cringeworthy moments. Coming in at number 5, the moment Jeremy Corbyn made Theresa May almost fall off her seat laughing.
Did she actually know what arrangement was made with Surrey County Council?
At number 4, the iconic Fields of Wheat moment.
What's the naughtiest thing you ever did?
Oh, goodness me. Well, I suppose gosh, do you know, I'm not quite sure.
Well, there must have been a moment.
Nobody's ever perfectly behaved, are they? I mean, you know, I have to confess, when me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat, the farmers weren't too pleased about that.
Number 3, we've all been there. You walk out thinking you're about to get into the right car, and then realise it's not for you. Well, at least she manages to style it out gracefully. Number 2, in her first meeting with EU leaders post-Brexit vote, Theresa May ended up looking like the awkward guest at the dinner party. And finally, number 1, last year's Tory party conference. How could he possibly forget that?
Boris asked me to give it to him. Boris, job done there. Given other people.
So, why we will never... Oh, excuse me. All its diversity, compassion and strength that was shared around the globe.
I'll get that little piece of dandruff.
It seems that after months of negotiations, the UK has finally reached an agreement with the EU negotiators. Theresa May presented the deal to her cabinet. The reaction was, well, let's say mixed. The proposed deal passed through cabinet, but not without casualties. Dominic Raab and Esther McVeigh resigned from their cabinet positions as a result of May's deal. Before we get into the contents of the deal, let's quickly cover what will happen to the deal now. It's been agreed to by EU and UK negotiators, which is the first step. Then it was agreed to by May's cabinet, the second step. Now it needs to be approved by the EU summit, which is set to take place on the 25th of November. Then it will need to pass through the UK's House of Commons, likely to happen in the beginning of December. So what's actually in May's plan? What will it mean for the UK post-Brexit? The document dives into 3 key aspects of the deal: the financial settlement between the UK and the EU, the rights of UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK, and the way that they're going to prevent a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Despite the document being very lengthy, at 585 pages, only 7 pages are spent discussing the future trading relationship between the EU and UK. The full negotiations of future trade are still yet to come, so the brevity of this section isn't exactly surprising. Let's start with an area which probably caused the most problems for the UK and EU negotiators: the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I know we've talked about this in a lot of other videos, but let me just cover the background quickly. For more than 30 years there was conflict at the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, with Unionists and Nationalists fighting for the future of their nations. Nationalists wanted to see Northern Ireland become independent from the UK, while Unionists were in favour of Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. This conflict continued until 1998, when both sides reached a compromise. The result of the compromise is the Good Friday Agreement. This deal meant that Northern Ireland remained part of the UK, however, Northern Irish citizens were allowed to hold both British and Irish citizenship. On top of this, the deal permitted the Northern Irish to leave the UK and join Ireland in the future. This deal was designed to keep both sides happy, with the Nationalists being able to gain Irish citizenship, and Unionists satisfied that Northern Ireland was remaining within the UK. The result of the Good Friday Agreement was that hard borders and crossing points became a thing of the past. The border became more open and people and goods were able to pass freely between nations without checks or borders. Post-Brexit, that could be set to change. That's because back in January 2017, May declared that the UK would leave both the single market and customs union. No longer would the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland be fellow EU nations, sharing common rules and tariffs. Instead, the border between the two would be an outer EU border. So how does May propose resolving this issue? Well, the deal assumes a comprehensive free trade agreement will be signed between the EU and UK between March 29, 2019, when the UK actually leaves the EU, and the end of the transition phase at the end of 2020. This means that the free trade agreement doesn't need to come into force until January 2021, as the transition phase is set to continue until December 31st, 2020. During the transition phase, the UK will continue to follow EU rules and customs regulations, meaning that while we're in the transition phase, the border can stay open, as the UK and EU will continue following the same rules. It's only at the end of the transition period, when the UK no longer has to follow EU rules, that the whole Northern Ireland border issue comes back. Therefore, the EU and UK are hoping to reach a trade agreement before March 2021, to ensure that the transition can end and that the hard border doesn't need to return. Now this might just sound like them kicking the problem down the road. After all, they've had 2.5 years to reach a deal on leaving. What's to say that in the 21 months after the UK leaves the EU, they'll be able to reach a free trade agreement? Because of this exact issue, the EU insisted on having a backstop in place. If there were no backstop, Ireland would still be in the EU and Northern Ireland would leave, meaning that the hard border would likely return. For a long time, the EU suggested a backstop agreement, which left Northern Ireland in the EU's customs union, part of the single market, and within the EU's VAT system, until a final deal is reached. This would mean that until a free trade deal is reached between the UK and EU, Northern Ireland would remain close to the EU, and as such there wouldn't be any need for a hard border. However, May rejected this deal, as it's only Northern Ireland who's staying close to the EU, essentially shifting the border into the Irish Sea. The concern that many Brits have is this could potentially damage the overall union and could be a step towards Northern Ireland leaving the UK altogether. The UK's counteroffer was that the entirety of the UK would remain in the customs union instead of just Northern Ireland, a proposal which the EU rejected. Both sides ended up reaching a compromise in the proposed deal. The EU accepted that the entirety of the UK would remain in the EU's customs union until the end of the transition period, and the UK accepted that they weren't allowed to leave until the EU said so. Essentially, the backstop in May's deal means that the whole of the UK stays in the EU's customs union unless and until the EU agrees that the UK leaving won't result in a hard border. This essentially continues the transition period indefinitely, with the deal rather ominously noting that the Joint Committee could make a decision extending the transition period up to the 31st of December 20XX. That's not a typo, they simply mean that the transition period could be extended until the end of the century. While the UK is in this transition period, the agreement requires that the UK observe level playing field commitments, which means that they have to stay in alignment with the EU on competition and state aid, as well as employment and environmental standards, tax, and the rulings of the European Court of Justice. Okay, so you clicked on a video about Theresa May's deal, and all I've done so far is bang on about how hard it will be for May to pass a deal, backstops, and the history of the border. Surely there can't be so little in those 585 pages that I'm forced to pad this much. Pad so much, in fact, that I'm getting introspective about the fact that I'm padding. So let's run over some of the other key points. The UK has agreed in the proposed bill to pay the EU a £39 billion divorce settlement. I discussed the reasons behind a divorce settlement at length in another video, but essentially the payment comes in two parts. Payments towards the EU's budget and outstanding commitments. In 2014, the UK agreed to pay towards the EU's budget until the end of the current budgeting period in 2020. So some of the divorce settlement goes towards keeping this promise. The UK has also agreed to fund a large number of EU projects. The divorce payment means that the UK is continuing to pay what it promised initially, as long as the project in question is completed before 2030. This means that the UK could continue paying for projects taking place in the EU long after leaving. However, the reverse is also true, with EU nations forced to contribute what they promised to pay towards EU projects based in the UK. The rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU seem to be fully protected by May's proposed deal, which isn't surprising considering the UK and EU have agreed on this for months. EU citizens will be allowed to move to the UK until the end of the transition currently set for 2020. They'll be allowed to live and work in the UK, and if they stay for 5 consecutive years, they'll be allowed to stay in the UK permanently. The same is true for UK citizens living in the EU. the UK is set to continue stockpiling medicines. Without a trade deal in place, the UK can't rely on the fact that they'll be able to continue importing medicines from the EU post-Brexit. So as a precautionary measure, the UK will probably continue stockpiling drugs. The NHS also will be hit by the loss of EU staff. While EU staff in the UK can apply to become permanent residents, as we just discussed, it's possible that many won't do this and will end up returning to the EU. Financial services are incredibly important to the UK, with a large percentage of the UK's GDP coming from that sector. Currently, UK companies are able to work with EU clients using passporting rights. Essentially, passporting rights allow UK banks to operate in EU nations without having to set up subsidiaries in each country. The proposed deal only gives London's financial centre basic access to EU markets, known as equivalence, falling short of the access granted by passporting rights. Equivalence means that countries can only do business with the EU if the European Commission determines that the regulations and standards of the country are close enough to the EU's. This isn't ideal, considering that the rights of equivalence can be revoked with just 30 days' notice. Also, there's no real legal agreement on what constitutes equivalence, so it's likely that the Commission will force the UK to accept standards it doesn't like in order to remain equivalent. This is especially worrying for sectors where equivalence isn't accepted or recognised as a concept of EU law, sectors including the commercial banking industry and primary insurance. The Financial Conduct Authority said that if the UK loses passporting rights, UK banks could lose up to £9 billion, which would have ripple effects through the economy and employment. When it comes to travel, free movement of people will end, meaning UK citizens will no longer have the right to move or work to EU countries without a visa. The same applies to EU citizens coming to the UK. Despite this, visa-free travel will allow Brits to visit the EU without the need for a visa, and vice versa. The deal doesn't make clear what will happen to UK universities after 2020. Universities in the UK currently benefit from EU research funding, but this is set to stop when the UK leaves the EU. The deal sets out no provisions related to this, so we don't currently know what will happen to UK university funding or to the EU students and academics currently at UK unis. No Brexit video will be complete without talking about farming or fish. The UK says that when it leaves the EU, it will become an independent coastal state. This means that the UK will be consulted on fishing opportunities and invited to comment on EU fishery policies. The new plan likely means that the UK will be allowed to choose who has access to their waters, and as such the UK probably won't allow the EU to continue freely accessing its waters. However, some have complained that the proposed deal lacks clarity, with the Scottish fishing industry saying that the deal isn't clear enough. This should be concerning to May, as the 13 Scottish Conservative MPs have said that they'd vote against any bill which doesn't meet the needs of the Scottish fishing industry. For farming, the deal sets the UK up to leave the Common Agricultural Policy in March 2019. The future agricultural relationship between the UK and EU will then be arranged during the transition phase. In Parliament on Tuesday, Theresa May said that negotiations had not been a comfortable process, and neither the UK or EU were totally happy with the deal. The question is if both sides are happy enough with the deal for it to pass to the EU summit and on to Parliament.
Aux États membres de l'Union. Donc, Guy, je te donne tout de suite la parole pour entrer plutôt dans les détails de notre travail et de notre engagement.
I can promise you I cannot go into the details of the 585 pages that Michel Barnier has presented to us, but I want to start by saying that we still really regret Brexit, because the fact that an important, a big nation as the UK is leaving the European Union is still a wound today, and I still hope personally that there comes one day that the UK will come back into the European family. But what we have tried to do with Michel Barnier is to make the best of a very difficult situation after the Brexit decision, and I would like to congratulate, to underline the intense cooperation with Michel Barnier, who has done a tremendous job, and it's true that we have seen each other on a weekly basis to make progress in this. I think that what is delivered today on our table is the best agreement we could obtain, taking into account the positions of the UK on the one hand, but and that is very important, that we have strongly supported the integrity of the European project, of the European Union, of the single market. As Michel a few times has underlined, it is in fact not we who are leaving the UK. It is the UK who goes out of the European Union. And what this agreement is doing, that is, it combines a Brexit, because that was the purpose and the decision by the British people, with a scenario that avoids a disruption, a disaster for the economies, for the EU economy, but certainly for the UK economy. So it's a very, I think, important achievement. There are four, I will be very short, I think, key points in this agreement. It minimizes the disruption on both sides. And I think that is important for our economy, for our businesses, for our citizens. The second is that it will avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And what is important to underline, it is that not only for economic reasons, but more for political reasons. We could not accept a situation in which there was a fear for a return of the violence in Northern Ireland. And this called backstop that we have foreseen, that is foreseen in the proposal, avoids in any way and safeguard the Good Friday Agreement. The third is our top priority, the safeguard of the citizens' rights. There, I can tell you that the Parliament will continue now to scrutinize the implementation of this, because we are very well aware that the safeguards we obtain on citizens' rights have now to be implemented by the Home Office. And we want to be sure, before we give our consent, President, that this implementation is done in the right way, respecting all what the rights that have been safeguarded for our citizens here in this agreement. So there will be a scrutiny by the European Parliament of the implementation, and that will be an important element in the consent procedure beginning next year. And then finally, I think that this gives also a good basis for the future relationship. For the future relationship, there is still some ongoing work, because that also the European Council will have his say on this on the 25th of November. We will do our proposals, center proposals to Michel Barnier as Parliament. And for us, it's important that also in the future relationship, there is the integrity of the European project that is safeguarded, the single market is safeguarded, the four freedoms are safeguarded. So there can be no question of a cherry picking also in the future relationship. And I think that is also the clear line of our negotiator. So the final say is in the beginning of next year of the European Parliament. Once we have received the official documents, and that takes some weeks. In the meanwhile, the European Parliament will present a resolution to the plenary, and in this resolution we're going to make a more detailed assessment of the agreement on the one hand, and secondly our proposals for the future relationship. And normally in the November, or probably more in the December session, we will propose an in-depth resolution to the plenary. And again, our sincere congratulations to Michel Barnier and to his whole team, because there is a whole team behind it that has done this tremendous work.
Merci beaucoup à vous tous. Merci encore une fois, Michel. Merci, Guy.
So despite the chaos at the heart of her government, Theresa May claims she is not for turning. At a news conference inside Number 10 this afternoon, she defended her Brexit plan to the very hilt. Leadership, she said, was about taking the right decisions, not the easy ones, declaring she believed with every fibre of my being that the deal was right for the country. But all this after a day of deepening political turmoil. The first resignations came before 9 o'clock this morning, followed by a series of others, like toppling dominoes. At the same time, the plot against Mrs May's leadership thickens. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. What do we know of plots?
This has, as you say, been the most extraordinary day, and we are not through all the drama yet. It is possible that there could be another major ministerial resignation. It looks as though Michael...
You know who?
Well, it looks as though Michael Gove was offered the job of Brexit Secretary, Dom Raab's job. But suddenly, Michael Gove, the man who sang the virtues of Theresa May's policy in Cabinet yesterday, seemed to be sort of frozen by this moment and felt that actually, now he thought about it, this wasn't a policy that he could take on. And I think he is currently wrestling with his conscience and with different voices in different ears. This day could end with another cabinet resignation of the one Brexiteer who actually backed the policy yesterday. We don't know that yet, but that is yet another thing that is a cloud that is hanging over Theresa May as we speak. It was the most extraordinary moment when she went into the House of Commons earlier. Long time taking questions, the whole atmosphere very glum. It was an hour before one supportive Tory got up to say anything that she really wanted to hear about her deal. We calculate that 37% of the Tories who spoke actually backed her, so it did improve a bit later, but that really was nothing. And then, straight off the back of that, she had this uprising led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, people making a push for a vote of no confidence in her, fighting on another front. And talking to people tonight, it is very clear that the guiding principle of that uprising is people who want no deal. They don't trust her if her deal is blocked in the House of Commons, not to revert to no deal, even though she's always had this mantra, hasn't she? No deal is better than a bad deal. They don't trust her to do that. They think that she would suddenly leap over across the floor and cut some other deal with Jeremy Corbyn to try and get Labour on board, which would be much closer to Labour's very, very soft Brexit. And they're terrified of that. So action on many fronts. And of course, this is exactly the moment when she wanted to be selling the deal. Everything else is blocking all that out. We saw a little bit of the grid that they wanted to be working to in terms of selling the deal. My goodness, they're off the grid. This is how the day went here.
She just got news of a second cabinet resignation as she left Number 10. The Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, told her last night he couldn't stay in the government. And then she was off to Parliament.
The Prime Minister!
To defend a deal which MP after MP told her was already a lost cause.
The government simply cannot put to Parliament this half-baked deal that both the Brexit Secretary and his predecessor have rejected.
The Prime Minister comes before us today trying to sell us a deal that is already dead in the water.
So it's quite clear she cannot command the House of Commons on these proposals.
It will be blindingly obvious to the entire country that the Prime Minister's deal cannot pass this House.
Theresa May ignored those challenges but acknowledged the backstop arrangement she'd produced yesterday was a compromise that left even her uncomfortable.
I do not pretend that this has been a comfortable process, or that either we or the EU are entirely happy with all of the arrangements that have been included within it. But of course this is the case. This is an arrangement that we have both said we never want to have to use.
She faced a bruising question from the DUP, sounding like a party on the point of withdrawing its support for the government.
I could today stand here and take the Prime Minister through the list of promises and pledges that she made to this House and to us privately about the future of Northern Ireland in the future relationship with the EU. But I fear it would be a waste of time since she clearly doesn't listen.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
And then, as if she didn't have enough drama in her life, a threat by the leader of the Brexiteer hardliners to write letters to the chairman of the 1922 committee, sitting screen top right, demanding a vote of no confidence in her leadership.
My right honourable friend said that we would be out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Article 174 says otherwise. As what my right honourable friend says and what my right honourable friend does no longer match, should I not write to my right honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale West?
Her answer was never going to move him. Jacob Rees-Mogg and some of his faction sent in those letters demanding a vote of no confidence, hoping they can defeat her and get one of their own to number 10.
You've got Boris Johnson and David Davis, and you've got Dominic Raab and Esther McVeigh, you've got Penny Mordaunt. You have streams of talent within the Conservative Party who would be very capable of leading a proper Brexit.
People have said World Trade Organization rules are not something that we need to fear.
That sounds like that is part of the strategy of this uprising. It's the no deal uprising.
Because don't forget, it's not no deal. We don't have deals with a lot of countries we trade with now outside of the European Union.
You don't think this is a good idea. What's the strategy, do you think, behind those people, your colleagues and friends, who are pushing for the Prime Minister to be toppled?
They believe that she's going to panic after we vote down the deal, and she's going to do a deal with the Labour Party to keep us in some customs union or whatever. I don't know about all that.
There was a brief birthday drop-in at Clarence House with other party leaders, but there were cabinet jobs to fill back at the office. And at a press conference, Theresa May was asked if it was true Michael Gove had been offered the job of Brexit Secretary, but had said he'd only take it if he could renegotiate the deal.
There are reports tonight that Michael Gove has been asked to become the new Brexit Secretary, but that he will only take that job on condition that he is allowed to go back to Brussels and try for more concessions. There have been no announcements yet on any appointments to replace people who've resigned. Are you struggling to find people who want to fill those roles?
Now, I've had actually rather a busy day, as you might have seen, 3 hours in the House of Commons. Seriously, look, Michael has been doing an excellent job at DEFRA, and particularly in his defence of the fishing industry.
Will there be any more resignations this morning?
The Chief Whip, like the Prime Minister, fighting on two fronts tonight for her job and her Europe policy.
The Prime Minister will not be bullied and will not change course, and the Government and the Cabinet made a definite decision to back the deal, and we'll be looking forward to the November Council. I'm going to have to go because the Prime Minister's making a statement.
More resignations, Mr. Smith?
I don't know.
Does this look like a government that's disintegrating in front of you?
It is dissolving today.
Rallying for the Prime Minister has not yet hit fever pitch. It's been said there are some people in there, perhaps some surprising colleagues of yours, who are now beginning to think, well, maybe this whole project, the Theresa May project, her particular approach to Brexit, her premiership, is over.
There may be people who think that. There probably are. But let those who think that come and say how they would do it differently and better.
One of my cricket heroes was always Geoffrey Boycott. And what did you know about Geoffrey Boycott? Geoffrey Boycott stuck to it, and he got the runs in the end. Thank you.
It's a line she's often used, but will it be enough?
Gary Gibbon. Well, now, with me is the Education Secretary, Damien Hinds, who seems to be talking for the government tonight.
Hi.
Damien Hinds, yesterday, Mrs May said it's my deal, or no Brexit. We're down to no deal and no Brexit, correct?
No, I mean, this is a deal that's the deal that the Prime Minister has come back with. Still a draft deal. There's still some more work to do in it. There's the European Council to come on the 25th of November. But it's a good deal for Britain. It delivers on the Brexit result, to end free movement, to stop giving money ad infinitum in large quantities to Brussels, but also in a way that's good for trade with Europe.
I mean, we've heard all that from the Prime Minister.
Well, no, it's important. Hang on, it's important.
But let me put it to you this way.
And it's good for people's jobs.
That the man who negotiated this, Dominic Raab, thought it stank so badly that he's resigned himself. So what was she doing defending something the person she'd employed to negotiate didn't want?
Well, look, you've got to look at the deal that's on the table against some viable, alternative. And of course, people will find things that they don't like in what is quite a substantial package. And anybody probably could find something they don't like in it.
But he negotiated it.
But it is an overall package. And you've got to say, is there something else that's available which is better? There are people in this country who want to thwart the Brexit process altogether. You can hear some of them over there, and there are people in Parliament who believe that too. There are other people who want to have a no deal. I think either of those two things would be very bad for our country.
Right. Well,
and this deal is going to be good for our country.
Will the next Brexit Secretary be able to renegotiate this negotiation?
I don't think you can go back and totally renegotiate, because if you
but
do...
But will you be able to renegotiate bits?
This is after months and months of negotiating to get the best outcome for our country. Also a good outcome for the others, but actually a good outcome for our country. And if we went back and tried to open it up again, I mean, you can't guarantee it would get better. Other things would be opened up as well.
So if you can't get this through the House of Commons, that one is dead, and then what are you left with?
Well, I think we can get through the House of Commons.
But I ask you what happens if you can't.
Well, I don't accept that premise, because what we're engaged in is making the case for this package and asking people, you know, think about, don't just think, do you love this package? Do you like every element of it? But say, how does it compare to something else? Do you know something else which can be delivered,
I'll ask you that very question.
Which would be better?
How does it compare with being in the European Union? It sounds a much worse deal.
Well, look, we had a vote in 2016.
But you said, how does it compare? And I'm asking you.
Well, there were things that are different, clearly.
You're a Remainer, you can't be very happy.
But we would keep good trading arrangements with Europe, including, you know, frictionless trade at the border, leveraging our strength in services, but being able to end free movement, and that is very important, and being able to strike new trade deals across the world, which we weren't able to do before.
You, like many people, made a reasoned decision, and your decision was that you were a Remainer.
Correct.
Do you sleep easy at night, thinking that this deal is in some way better than being in the European Union?
I sleep easy at night because I was elected to this Parliament to be a Democrat. Yes, I campaigned for Remain. I don't resile from the things I said at the time. But, you know, the leaders of the three biggest political parties argued to people to vote one way. They voted the other way. We have to live up to that. We have to deliver on that, but make sure we do it in a way which is good for people's jobs, good for our economy.
Damien Hines, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Well, Labour today indicated it would vote down the Prime Minister's Brexit deal and called for Theresa May to withdraw it. But by doing so, will they deliver what their supporters want? I'm joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. John McDonnell, I can put the same question to you. You are not accepting this deal, that's correct, right?
Can't support it. It's not going to protect jobs in the economy, so there's no way we could vote for a bad deal like this.
So if Mrs May remains Prime Minister, she's only got two options, because you're going to vote down the other one. You'll be joined by the DUP and the European objectors like Rees-Mogg, etc. And you can defeat the government.
Let's go through the options. I don't think there are only two. I think there's a majority in the House of Commons now opposed to this deal that she's brought forward. I also think there's an overwhelming majority, again, opposed to no deal. So people want to have some form of deal. We believe we can negotiate a deal which can protect jobs in the economy based upon a permanent customs union, close collaborative relationship with the single market, protecting workers, employment rights, consumer rights and environmental rights.
For a moment? I mean, we're talking about a negotiation which will take months. Now, on March the 29th, we're supposed to leave the European Union. That's obviously becoming a very ludicrous date.
We think if the government moves over, because they're only a minority government, it's a minority party in control of the government at the moment, let the opposition take over, we can get the negotiations underway. We think we can achieve a Brexit which will protect the jobs in the economy. And if the government doesn't move over, let's have a general election.
Now, you see, the fact is that if you listen to many members of the Labour Party and many shadow ministers, they're not at all happy about any of this. But your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is so opposed to the European Union that he would not brook any kind of relationship like this one, the one that Mrs May has articulated, which you're going to reject, agreed. But he wouldn't consider any possibility of remaining in Europe.
No, what he said very, very clearly is what Labour Party policy is, that we want to create a negotiating environment, and we think we can do that in government.
Yes, with a single market and with a
that gives us a Brexit that will protect jobs in the economy.
But that is precisely a Brexit that leaves no British power in Europe to negotiate any of these things.
Well, I disagree.
Rules will be set by people that
I disagree, because if we're in a customs union, we're saying within that customs union we want to ensure that we have a significant say in future trade deals, which has a large market.
But to have a significant say, you have to be members of the European Union.
No, if you're in a customs union, that would be part of that membership. That would enable us to happen. With regard to a single market, that will give us the tariff-free access that we want. And we want to ensure that we have those protections for workers, environment, and consumers. I think that's all achievable. All right. It isn't under this government. That's why we're saying move to one side, let us get on with the negotiations. If not, general election.
You're a seasoned politician. You've been around a long time. What's going to happen?
The way it's happening is so unpredictable. The Conservative Party are falling apart. You've seen today they've lost the support of the DUP. I can't see that they're sustainable in these negotiations. I'm not sure if they're sustainable in government. That's why I'm saying to him, in the interest of the country, move over.
And you think you could win that election?
Constitutionally, they should just move over and let's see whether we can form a government. If not, let's have that election. I'm confident that we can.
John McDonnell, thank you very much for joining us. Well, the mood on the markets is volatile, to say the very least. City regulators summoned Britain's biggest banks today to discuss the turbulence after the continuing Brexit chaos sent the pound and share prices plunging. Business leaders had initially welcomed Theresa May's draft agreement, but now all those hopes of certainty seem to be as distant as ever. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has this report.
While the politicians go hammer and tongs in Westminster, here they're hammering out metal packaging for big customers like Boots and The Body Shop at this factory in Thamesmead. The production line may be smooth, but the Brexit process that determines their future is anything but.
This business encapsulates all the challenges of Brexit. It's seeing consumer demand falling here in the UK, while at the same time new potential customers are rattled. It's having to look for warehousing space to stockpile products, and it may even have to open new manufacturing facilities in Europe if there's no deal. Now extrapolate that to the tens of thousands of small and medium businesses in the UK, and it paints a bleak picture.
And then came the resignation of the Brexit secretary himself.
It's just completely crazy. I just cannot see how you could be part of the agreement that's being proposed and then you resign because of it.
Like many companies, the EU represents a huge chunk, in Chris Saunders' case, 40% of his overall business. So if the already fragile deal is sunk by politicians, his business would be right on the edge.
Worst case scenario, if there is a no deal, what does that mean for you?
The only thing we'd be able to do is to look at setting up a plant in mainland Europe. And of course that will mean jobs will go in the UK and we would be certainly moving part of the operation over to mainland Europe. I don't think we'd have any choice. What are we going to do if we find ourselves in a no-deal situation?
And it was that reality that was weighing heavily on the markets today. Here's what happened to the value of the pound the moment Dominic Raab tweeted his resignation at 8:53 a.m. And FTSE firms exposed to the UK economy, notably the banks and house builders, were also in the red as traders bet the chaos in Westminster would hit spending and investment, further dragging down an already sluggish economy. Nothing sluggish about a high-end Aston Martin. Of course, they're reserved only for the wealthiest, but it does employ hundreds of workers. And the boss of this most iconic British brand says even they're not immune.
We still have to worry about parts. We run a just-in-time manufacturing system. We have generally 3 days of stock. We have 3,900 parts which are crossing the channel. One of those parts gets stuck at the port, production stops.
Did you ever in your wildest dreams think that we would be here where we are today at the end of 2018?
When the vote happened, I famously quoted that, for me, that it was unthinkable that you only needed to put sensible people around a table and you would inevitably come to a deal. I'm looking a bit foolish, I guess.
He was one of the few bosses to put his head above the parapet. Even those in Theresa May's 5 business councils were decidedly camera shy. But these written statements from Airbus, BMW and Siemens to Channel 4 News echoed the wider sentiment.
We look forward to further clarity and the removal of uncertainty.
We recognise that the situation remains politically uncertain. We must therefore continue to prepare for the worst case scenario.
Keep calm and support the deal.
But it's a deal that's very much hanging in the balance. Last night it seemed the crisis had been contained. But today business fears their friction-free Brexit could be slipping away.
We'll be back later in the programme with the latest from here in Westminster. Let's go now over to Matt, back in the studio.
Thanks, John. So what's been the response from Europe? Let's call the whole thing off, according to European Council President Donald Tusk, who suggested that the EU was, of course, best prepared for a no-Brexit scenario. Quite the opposite reaction from the French Prime Minister, who said that Paris was getting prepared for a no-deal scenario. As I discovered in Brussels in the last 24 hours, all that talk of no Brexit and no deal overshadowed what the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, considered a proud and historic compromise. No, it's not an extraterrestrial spaceship, but the sphere of the European Council, which today seemed like a parallel universe to the shambolic events in London. Shuffling between EU buildings, Michel Barnier has been showing off his proud 585-page creation like a newborn baby. Here he was last night, lovingly cradling the document, the fruit of 17 months of painstaking gestation. Was he at all worried that it might be strangled soon after birth in London?
The two negotiators, the two negotiating team have taken their responsibility. The British government has taken today, this evening, its responsibility. And now everybody on both sides have to take their responsibility.
A tall order. Later, I try again. Mr. Barnier, Matt Price from Channel 4 News. How worried are you that the British Parliament will destroy all the good works of the last 17 months?
I'll just give you the answer. Yes. I think that everybody has to take its responsibility. No? Yes. I don't want to comment what will happen in the domestic policy.
Undeterred, Mr. Barnier carried on parading the creation around its new godparents. Early this morning, he allowed Donald Tusk to have a peek. Considering that the EU never wanted the Brexit child, they've shown far more affection for it than the London parent who originally called for its conception.
If nothing extraordinary happens, we will hold a European Council meeting in order to finalise and formalise the Brexit agreement.
But in London, the extraordinary has become the ordinary. Mr. Barnier was off again, this time to Strasbourg and the European Parliament, where they were also handed a copy. By now, news was filtering through that the newborn was in trouble, that the christening summit at the end of November might never even take place, and yes, that all this chaos might even have a silver lining. By this afternoon, Donald Tusk was mouthing an option that had not dared to speak its name.
All I can say is that the EU is prepared for a final deal with the United Kingdom in November. We are also prepared for a no-deal scenario. But of course we are best prepared for a no-Brexit scenario.
But from inside the egg, also a very clear message to London. The deal is the best on offer. Don't even think about renegotiating it. You live with the child you've conceived, not the child you ideally want. Well, in the last hour, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has warned that the worst-case scenario is a no-deal Brexit and said that it's now up to the UK and other member states to finalise the deal that is on the table.
We now have a document on the table that Britain and the EU 27 have agreed to. For me, there's no question at the moment whether we'll negotiate further. Both negotiating partners went home with the understanding that this is the potential exit deal.
Michael, as it stands, we don't seem to have a Brexit secretary tonight. What's the latest?
We don't have a Brexit secretary, we don't have a work and pensions secretary yet. The chief whip just walked back into Downing Street. It looks like it could be a long evening. Theresa May was asked at her press conference why we hadn't got a Brexit secretary yet. She said it's been a busy day. It has. Rarely can a Prime Minister have answered questions in public for 3.5 hours. The speculation tonight is around Michael Gove, the Environment Secretary, and Penny Mordaunt, the Development Secretary. Might they resign? Might they be in line for new jobs? Michael Gove's thought to be mulling this over. Penny Mordaunt was in Downing Street for an hour after the press conference. She then drove herself home rather than go in a government car, but she said we shouldn't read too much into that, which suggests to me that she is staying on, but who knows whether she's got a new job. The problem with Brexit Secretary, of course, is that Brexiters have held that job twice before and ended up resigning because they haven't been able to influence the deal in the way they wanted.
Michael, matters beyond that door behind you. A lot of talk today about a possible leadership election. Is it going to happen?
Well, indeed, earlier this afternoon when Jacob Rees-Mogg announced he'd written a letter to Graham Brady of the 1922 committee asking for a no-confidence vote, it looked like they were going to reach the magic threshold of 48, which would trigger such a no-confidence vote. But that hasn't happened today. Earlier at lunchtime, I went to the meeting of the European Research Group, or rather I stood outside it. Unfortunately, there was a glass panel in the committee room door, so you could see what was going on inside. There were about 35, 40 people in there, including Boris Johnson, Ian Duncan Smith, the last Tory leader to suffer a no-confidence vote, but perhaps not the numbers that you might expect. The group is meant to be a fair bit bigger than that. And interestingly, it's clear there were divisions. Rees-Mogg was clapped and with the, the traditional thumping of the desks after he made his speech. But Sir Edward Lee came out and said there were differences within the group, and Rees-Mogg confirmed this later. There are those members of the ERG who think that a leadership election, a no-confidence vote right now would be counterproductive, that Theresa May would win it, and that would reinforce her position, and they couldn't then have another no-confidence vote under the rules for another 12 months. If one is to happen, it could happen as early as Monday or Tuesday if the 48 figure is suddenly reached. But at the moment, we've only got about 10 names that we know have written letters so far, but that could change tonight or tomorrow. But Theresa May made it clear in her press conference she's going to fight on.
Michael Crick at number 10. Ken Clarke has long been one of the most pro-European of the Conservatives. Now his party is facing possibly the biggest crisis it's seen during the 48 years he's been spending in Parliament. He joins me now. Ken Clarke, can you think of any day as chaotic as this?
No, we had quite a lot of crises when we were joining the European Union, when the party was split, Enoch Powell and the Imperialists against us and relying on Jenkinsite Labour. We had a lot of trouble over Maastricht, it was very nasty. This is far, far worse, and it's more chaotic, and nobody has a clue where we're going in the next few weeks.
Michael Crick was just reporting on the numbers of people that seem to be sending in letters to demand the head of Mrs May and an election. What's your view on that?
A bit of a footnote, I think. And Brexiteers are doing that when they can't think of anything else to do, and they keep thinking that threatening her will get her to back down in their direction even further. But actually, she will win a confidence motion amongst Conservative MPs. Perversely, it might strengthen her briefly, but it will rather divert us from the more serious business. How are we supposed to be looking after the national interests and avoiding damaging our trade, our investments, our jobs in the new year?
Well, now she says that what is really preoccupying every fibre of her body is getting her deal through the Commons.
Well, I admire that. Her resilience is quite remarkable. I think she'll have to be a little flexible. After today's exchanges, I can't see how she gets a majority. The vote's a few weeks away yet in Parliament, but, I mean, it looks quite hopeless. She's going to have to actually make a wider appeal, stop making concessions to these hard right-wing nationalists who obviously hate her and are trying to get rid of her and are not going to compromise, and actually seek a broader appeal, a softer Brexit, if you like, which might command some cross-party support, because across parties, the majority of members of Parliament don't want to damage our economic relationships with the continent and are quite content to see the best of the single market and the customs union continue.
What do you make of a Brexit secretary now, the late Brexit secretary in terms of political nomenclature? What do you make of somebody who nominally puts his name to this document that she's been flashing about, that Mrs May has in her hand, but not in fact believing in it and then resigning because he hates it?
Well, I'm not going to attack Dominic. I mean, he's in an impossible position. She's insisted on appointing very hardline Brexiteers to negotiate the deal. And this is the second one who's finally decided that there's a high and dry, and upon reflection, they don't like the deal, and they're very worried about compromising themselves with their right-wing colleagues in the party. So I don't know how far Dominic tried to steer away from what, for a few hours, he signed up to.
Well, in the last 30 seconds we have, put your 48 years of experience in the House of Commons to the test. What's going to happen in the next 3 months?
Anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen in the next 3 months is deceiving themselves. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 days. I hope that parliamentary democracy will regain some courage. We're all pursuing the national interest. The vast majority of us, the vast majority do not want to damage the economy or future generations. Theresa's got to be a bit flexible. On both sides, people have got to be pragmatic. And the Corbynistas are a waste of time, they're hardline Brexiteers. Jacob Rees-Mogg's followers are a waste of time, they're hardline nationalists. But in between, it's time for all good men to come rally to the interests of the country, to use a corny phrase.
Ken Clark, thank you for joining us. Well, tonight we have correspondents live in key cities around the country. In Belfast, where political leaders are warning that this is not a time for incendiary language. In Edinburgh, where Scotland's government say they've been totally sidelined by Theresa May's deal. And in Cheshire, in the constituency of Esther McVey, one of the cabinet ministers who resigned today. Well, let's go first to Porrick O'Brien in Belfast. Northern Irish political leaders met the Irish Taoiseach earlier today without the DUP. That is, they're furious about the backstop deal, claiming it will lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. Earlier, we caught up with one of the UK government ministers who's been speaking in support of Theresa May and her deal. Porrick.
John, I'm standing here in front of the Titanic Museum, close to the spot where the ship was built, trying to resist the urge of the clunky metaphor. Let me paint a picture of the big political picture here in Belfast at the moment. Remember, the majority of people here in Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. The Democratic Unionist Party, who were propping up Theresa May's government, now pose an existential threat to said government. The main opposition party, Sinn Féin, don't take their seats at Westminster. And against the backdrop of all of that, government stormont here, not working at all, in shutdown. I can resist the clunky metaphor no longer. If the withdrawal agreement for Northern Ireland was an ocean liner, what sort of ship would it be? Two were built side by side on the docks here. RMS Olympic, nicknamed Old Reliable. And its sister, well, you know the story. The task of selling the deal to business leaders fell to the Northern Irish Secretary, Karen Bradley, here this evening.
It's been an interesting day.
The day had started with a junior Northern Ireland minister resigning over the deal. And as you've heard, that was just the start. Minister, how would you describe the car crash that's unfolding in London at the moment?
I wouldn't describe it in that way at all. I would describe it as a very difficult decision. And government takes difficult decisions, and this is probably one of the most difficult decisions that government faces. How do we deliver on the vote of the British people that was made 2.5 years ago to leave the European Union? And it's not easy, but I support the Prime Minister. There's no better person to do this job. I supported her for leadership in 2016 because this is a woman that gets the job done.
Yesterday, businesses were digesting the draft agreement with cautious optimism, the DUP, though, doing the opposite. In Dublin, the Taoiseach was hailing it as a genuine economic opportunity for Northern Ireland. But that was yesterday. Today, the focus, what will become of Theresa May's government.
I think it's going to wreck the country, to be honest with you. I think that it's going to wreck the government. It's going to wreck things back in Northern Ireland here.
And I think the demand has to be general election now. We've had enough.
But admiration for the Prime Minister too. For this lever cometh the hour, cometh the woman.
I think what we've seen of the EU over the past couple of years really shows perhaps that that was the right thing to do. It's a bit like the Hotel California. You know, you can check out any time, but you can never leave.
At least one vote of confidence then in the captain. We struggle to find anyone, though, here with much confidence at all in the ship.
Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins is in Edinburgh. Nicola Sturgeon has accused Theresa May tonight of provoking a shambles and ignoring Scotland's interests altogether. No love lost there then, Kieran?
Absolutely not, John. The First Minister raging at the mess she says the Tories are making, chaos that she says makes the case for independence stronger every day. But you know what? Nicola Sturgeon's comments weren't even the most vicious, levelled at a Tory from Scotland today. That came from within their own ranks, from the Scottish Secretary himself, David Mundell, in a savage interview about the Brexit Secretary, the former Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, over his resignation. which is funny because David Mundell and Ruth Davidson widely thought to have hinted themselves that they would quit over fishing or the integrity of the union, which of course many Tories believe is under threat in this deal. Both are now staying, both say they're satisfied. How satisfied is the fishing industry tonight? Have a watch of this.
As the boats came in at Peterhead this morning.
You were at sea when this Brexit deal was agreed.
I haven't heard anything about Brexit.
Among those who had heard, some wondered, had Britain's fishermen just been sold out?
160. Are you surprised? Are you really surprised?
Are you surprised?
No, not really.
Are you disappointed?
Very disappointed. We've been disappointed since we left school. Don't worry about it.
The deal, says the Prime Minister, means we're leaving the common fisheries policy, the EU rules over fishing access.
An essential condition for the single customs territory to cover fisheries.
And in its place, says the EU's chief negotiator, will be a new agreement over fishing access.
Michel Barnier is already talking about access to waters and fishing opportunities as part of the new agreement.
That means we don't get our waters back.
Don't get your waters back.
On the back of us,
it was hinted Scottish Tory leader Ruth Davidson and the Scottish Secretary David Mundell might even quit if the deal compromised fishing or gave a different status to Northern Ireland.
Can you sell it to the Cabinet, Mr. Raab?
Resigning ministers, including the Brexit Secretary, believe the agreement would undermine the union.
Does this agreement meet your needs?
But Ruth Davidson and David Mundell believe their red lines have not been breached, the latter now openly scrapping with his former cabinet colleague.
I'm not taking lessons on standing up for our United Kingdom from carpetbaggers. So this is more about manoeuvring and leadership. I'm absolutely committed to the integrity of the United Kingdom.
First Minister. Talk a bit tired old rhetoric.
The verdict from Scotland's First Minister.
People the length and breadth of the UK are seriously worried about their jobs, about their living standards, all of which are on the line because of the ideology of this Tory government and the complete shambles that they have made of the negotiation.
What's your hunch about how this is going?
I don't think it's going to be good.
Supplies of optimism running low today as Brexit and perhaps the government itself are on the line.
So let's now see what voters think, and we're in Knutsford tonight in the constituency of Esther McVey, who resigned as Work and Pension Secretary this very morning, saying the Brexit deal does not honour the result of the referendum. Do her constituents agree? Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon is there. Claire.
Well, Esther McVey has only been the MP for this area since last year's election. She was picked after her predecessor quit Parliament to concentrate on running his newspaper down in London. This is a safe Tory seat, but people here also voted Remain in the referendum. And talking to people here, they frankly say Esther McVey is not their concern right now, but they say they are genuinely worried about where we go next with Brexit. The Tory heartland of the north, this is the turf of the Cheshire set. In its tea shops and delis, there's no sign of no-deal Brexit bulk buying. But there is a sense of reluctant resignation at what's next.
I don't think asking me what we should do to get out of the mess is going to make a great deal of difference, because the people who might be able to make a difference won't be listening to me.
This man didn't want to tell me his name. He seemed bemused as to why journalists hang around on streets asking people for their views. But not all politicians give as thoughtful answers.
There were numerous stages at which we didn't have to get into this mess. Some of those decisions were done for political reasons, so I think that was stupid. But you started off asking me what do we do about the mess we're in.
And you think we shouldn't be in it?
Well, I don't think the stupidity that got us into it has changed.
Tatton is safe Tory, but it's given the party the odd problem in the past.
Neil Hamilton on the one hand and Martin Bell on the other.
1997, the Battle of Knutsford Heath. Today, another former Tatton MP used his newspaper to add to the pressure on Theresa May. While George Osborne's successor, Esther McVey,
Mr. Speaker,
quit the cabinet, her resignation letter saying she couldn't vote for the Brexit deal and look her constituents in the eye. Some constituents seem to be more Team May than Team McVey, though.
Theresa May, in all good faith, has done the best that she can. I think it's an extremely difficult decision that's had to be made.
I think there is more division yet to come. I think we will end up going out with nothing. And we'll just have to work it out from then. But who will? I don't know. I look at poor Theresa May and I think, oh, crikey, why did you take it on? But who would have taken it on? So we might have had, I have to say, Boris Johnson.
For all the talk of a divided Brexit Britain, it seems exasperation and uncertainty are the things that now unite it. Claire Fallon, Channel 4 News, in Knutsford.
So back here in Westminster, what now for Theresa May and what indeed for Brexit? To discuss all that, I'm joined by the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and by the Guardian columnist, Zoe Williams. Fraser Nelson, what do you know, or what does your very profound ear to the ground tell you of the real threat to Theresa May?
Well, there's a lot of discontent, but the ERG, the European Research Group, they had a WhatsApp discussion today saying, is it time to go in for the kill? And they thought, no, not now. If we did a leadership coup right now, a confidence motion, she would probably win. Under the Tory rules, if she wins, she's safe for a year. You can't challenge her until well into the other set of negotiations.
What about these letters, though?
Well, we've had Jacob Rees-Mogg and about 15 other Tories say they've sent them in. They need 48. But the rest will come in a batch. Other Tories who want her gone are keeping these letters in the envelopes, so they coordinate, but don't want to let them dribble. They want to control the time of the challenge if it comes, and they think today that the time is not now.
And even if the challenge comes, is she in trouble?
Well, that's difficult, of course. You know, she once had lunch with a senior chap in politics, saying how much. Oh, David Cameron, right? And he basically, she asked him, like, how much do you have to win by the confidence motion to survive? And he was saying, 1. And she goes, yes, that's what I think. So her rationale is, if you won even by 1 in the confidence motion, then you'll still be all right. Practically, is that true? I doubt it. Do you imagine hundreds of Tories vote against you, or 100? Could you really survive? But she is willing to stare them down, thinking, and she could be right, but none of them have actually got it together enough to challenge her.
Now, Zoe Williams, do you sense at all, given that Mrs May put no deal, my deal, and
no Brexit
on the table yesterday, do you sense that Remainers are beginning to feel a little hopeful?
Hopeful? I mean, it was extraordinary that she put no Brexit on the table, because she can't have been anticipating the cheer she got in the House of Commons. You know, I think there are a lot of shy Remainers in the Commons who haven't been saying how they feel because there was no kind of political air for them and no space for them, and they didn't actually want to ally with the open Remainers in the Commons. You know, I'm a Remainer. We are kind of emboldened. We are hopeful about this. But the only way I see it, I agree with Fraser. I don't think the chances are very high of a no confidence motion. I don't think the chances are very high of a general election. But I do think the pressure is building. I think if the deal doesn't go through, which it won't, the pressure for a second vote is really building.
Are you surprised, or perhaps do you find it inevitable, that Labour appears not to be exerting any pressure on anybody anywhere at the moment in this contest?
That's a very loaded question.
It is a loaded question.
I'm not particularly surprised. I mean, why interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake? Tories are beating each other up so much, we don't really need the help of the Labour Party. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's quite zen about Brexit. He doesn't really talk about it either way. Yeah. That isn't hurting him too much in the polls, as far as I can work out.
I don't agree with that. I think if he were more... to be honest, if he'd responded more to the democratic pressure in his own party, I think he'd be higher in the polls. I think it's extraordinary that Theresa May can be operating like this and still be beating him in the polls. I think he should, you know, everybody knows he's ambivalent about Europe. But the truth of it is, they had their conference. The CLP said, we want another vote with an option to remain. That, if he went hell for leather on that, then I think he'd get a bounce like you wouldn't believe.
It doesn't look at the moment as if the government can get a Brexit deal through. Do you think we're already in no-deal territory?
We could be, but Theresa May's gamble is that, first of all, nobody's going to challenge her. Secondly, nobody's going to come up with a better plan. And fundamentally, she thinks that a plan beats no plan. Unless anybody's got a better deal than her, a better thing of getting through Parliament, then she reckons hers will have to pass because there is no practical alternative. Well, apparently he's been offered the Brexit Secretary job today, and he's been agonising it, but there isn't really a job there, and I'm not quite sure anybody can fix it.
Well, this is what I did not know, and I fancy myself as a journalist. I didn't realise that actually the political leadership of the Brexit negotiations is a complete charade.
Oh, yeah. No, Raab wasn't in charge of it, and Gove wouldn't be in charge of it, and David Davis wasn't in charge of it.
It's a civil servant, so that's partly why Dominic Raab left, because he saw this Brexit agreement of clauses that he didn't write, he didn't welcome, and he found out that Ollie Robbins has been doing it, and Theresa May's been dealing with him, and therefore, why go through this political direction?
I don't really agree with that, because if the civil servants really had been in charge of it, they would have said a year ago, this project, nobody with the enthusiasm has the confidence.
There we must leave it. Thank you both.
The idea that the United Kingdom and the European Union can have a Brexit without a deal is a non-starter, and I put my neck absolutely out there and say to you very clearly, I do not see any circumstances in which there will be a no-deal Brexit. There simply isn't a majority for it, either in the British House of Commons or in the European Parliament either. And they are the two parliaments that must vote on this. So that's not a situation that is going to arise. And secondly, the point that's being made by many people who supported Brexit, that if we have a no-deal Brexit, we can have many smaller mini-agreements put in place, and that the first and primary one would be a bilateral between the UK and the Republic of Ireland to help resolve this issue. They forget and misunderstand one basic fact, that when it comes to trade, it is the European Union that negotiates on behalf of all of its member states. So that would not be a bilateral between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. It would be a bilateral between the EU and the UK. So you get absolutely no further to where you are at this moment in time.
Surviving a bruising day as her Brexit deal came under attack by politicians from all sides, really. UK Prime Minister Theresa May seems to be calling for unity. This is her tweet from earlier. I believe with every fibre of my being that the course I've set out is the right one for our country and for our people. Niall Gardner joins us, Heritage Foundation Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom Director. Good to have you, Niall. Take this in order a little bit and, talk about her plan in a moment. But what about her political survival, which seemed to be in question yesterday? I even saw something from Sky News this afternoon that a no-confidence vote was likely to take place. But what I don't know is whether or not her opponents have the votes to kick her out. So what are you hearing?
That's a very good question, actually. And so my understanding is that the Brexit rebels who are calling for a no-confidence vote, they're very close, I think, to having the number of letters required to force a vote of no confidence of the Prime Minister. We could see that vote happening as early as Tuesday. And then all Conservative Party MPs will vote on the future of Theresa May. I would say right now that it's sort of 50-50 whether she would survive that vote, if indeed there is going to be a vote next week. She's in a very precarious position.
If she survives, she's in for a year, right? They can't bring it up for another year. So I wonder whether they'll even bring it up.
Yeah. If she wins a vote of no confidence, then she cannot be challenged for a whole year. So it's a high-risk gambit, of course, for the Conservative Party rebels here. But I think that there is widespread disillusionment within the Conservative Party over Theresa May's handling of the Brexit negotiations. This Brexit deal is seen as a complete and utter disaster. And so I think her situation is very, very weak right now. If she loses that vote, then there'll be a leadership contest within the Conservative Party. She could decide to either resign on the spot or take part in that leadership contest. But I think that there's a very good chance we could see a new British Prime Minister by the end of the year.
Interesting. Now, whether that happens or not, Great Britain is leaving the European Union, right? No matter what, in, I guess, March. Yes. March of next year, they're leaving. So what if there's no plan that's been talked about approved by then, what would actually happen? And I think that's one thing markets are obviously concerned about. What would it actually look like?
Yeah, so Brexit takes place definitely on March 29th, 2019. And the issue right now is whether or not Britain is going to move forward with an approved deal between London and Brussels, a negotiated settlement with the European Union, or whether Britain actually has a no-deal arrangement with the EU. There's a third possibility. We could see a renegotiation of Theresa May's deal with the EU. So there is a third possibility. If indeed there is a no-deal scenario, then there will be no transition period for Great Britain, which is due to last until the end of 2020. And so Britain will be immediately outside of the EU single market and the EU customs union.
Right.
So there will be no fixed arrangement with the European Union. Basically, the UK will have to arrange a series of ad hoc deals with the EU in order to continue to facilitate business and trade.
Yep, that obviously, that's the thing that could get messy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm confident, though, that Britain will prevail, do well, even in a no-deal scenario. This is the world's 5th largest economy. It's Europe's 2nd biggest economy after Germany. It's in the interest of the EU, I think, to continue working closely with Great Britain and ensuring that trade and business continue as normal.
Right. All right, Niall, it's always good to have you on, and we'll obviously keep watching this. It's fascinating politically, if nothing else. Niall, thanks a lot.
The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so anybody who wishes to ask a question, I would urge them to press their request to speak button as soon as possible, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity at this important moment in the Brexit process to update the Chamber. Though, given the speed of current developments, I'm not confident I'll be able to cover everything, or that things will not have changed again before I sit down. However, at the outset, let me say I make this statement with a heavy heart. Scotland voted to stay in the EU in June 2016 by 62% to 38%. To be dragged out of the EU against our will is democratically wrong and will be deeply resented by many in this country. Those of us who regard ourselves as Europeans and Scots, and whose life experience has been embedded in that identity, will feel particularly sad and sore. Now, no doubt there are others who will rejoice at what is taking place, and I respect their view. But it is fair to note that the experience of Brexit and the demonstration of Tory incompetence over the last 2 years has not only resulted in a growing number of those who wish to remain in the EU, but also in a diminution in those who are in any way persuaded by the empty bluster of the Conservative Party in Scotland on these matters. Today's polls tell that story. I believe a future election would confirm it. But this is a sad day nonetheless. A day in which spin, rhetoric, the misuse of funds and the manipulation of electoral legislation has led to the worst and most damaging decision made by a UK government in any of our lifetimes. A day in which the UK government has attempted, voluntarily and for its own selfish political purposes, to actually lower the standard of living for all the citizens of Scotland and to distance itself from the global benefits of the world's largest free trade bloc. The Prime Minister last night described this proposed agreement as the best that could be obtained in the circumstances. But what a difference a day makes, particularly to circumstances. Her deal was the inevitable result of a series of self-imposed draconian red lines, the wish to turn her back on sensible cooperation across our continent, and the loose talk and empty rhetoric of her cabinet, who have shown contempt for evidence-based policymaking. And the death of her deal over the past 24 hours, for it is now essentially dead, arises from the same insularity, the same wrong-headedness and the same arrogance. She has only herself to blame for the appalling circumstances she has found herself in. Appalling circumstances not just for her, but for all of us on these islands. Presiding Officer, there's been much analysis of the deal already, despite the fact that the details are still not as clear as they should be, particularly with regard to the political declaration. But briefly, this deal, first of all, maintains a form of customs union for a period of time for all of these islands. That is in itself welcome, but because it is partial, does not include any of the advantages of the single market, and may be temporary, it is nowhere near good enough. Secondly, it makes a differentiation between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in similar terms to those which we suggested for Scotland 2 years ago. Thirdly, it prepares the ground for a continuing betrayal of our fishing interests. Fourthly, it fails to guarantee key rights, human rights, environmental rights, employment rights, which we need and which we should never give up. And finally, by its language and outcomes, it continues to ignore the current devolution settlement and the democratic institutions in Scotland and Wales. Indeed, as the Prime Minister herself confirmed this morning, Scotland does not exist in her thinking about this deal. A fact very tellingly illustrated by the distinguished blogger and legal writer David Alan Green, when he pointed out this morning on Twitter that the document that outlines the deal does refer to the British Antarctic Territory, but makes no mention at all of Scotland. Presiding Officer, in summary, this proposed deal does not meet the frequently stated Scottish Government requirement of single market and customs union membership for the whole of the UK, which failing for Scotland. Does not make even a gesture towards recognising the vote of Scotland to remain. Does not tackle the considerable and grave problems that will be caused by Scotland coming out of the single market and customs union. Takes away the 4 freedoms, and in particular freedom of movement, which is essential for Scotland, and fails to address in any way the additional pressures on Scotland if its neighbour in Northern Ireland retains the advantages of single market and customs union involvement. It cannot, therefore, be supported by this government or by the SNP. Presiding Officer, much of Scotland looks at the current state of the UK government and Brexit with astonishment and resentment. Scotland is an outward-focused European nation. We voted to remain within the European Union. It is clear that we would do so again tomorrow if a similar referendum was held. The Scottish Government has been clear and remains clear that the best outcome for Scotland is to be within the EU. But, and it is a big but, that has cost the Scottish Government a great deal of effort, we have repeatedly tried to find a compromise position which would allow the UK Government and the Scottish Government to move forward, but to no avail. So what is to be done? Well, first of all, we should take some heart from a major development just this week when the leaders of all the opposition parties at Westminster, including Jeremy Corbyn and Vince Cable, took action to ensure that there will be the opportunity for other proposals to be put when the so-called meaningful vote is heard. There are many alternatives that might be considered, including the Scottish Government policy of remaining in the single market and the customs union, as well as an EEA model, remaining in the EU, as the Prime Minister herself let slip. It is an option yesterday. So no one can argue that the choice is whatever the Prime Minister says it is. The choice will be what the people and their elected representatives say it should be. We will therefore, as a party in the House of Commons, continue to work in a constructive and common-sense way with other opposition parties to try and save us from the chaos of this Tory Brexit. And I commit the Scottish Government to the same constructive working which we have tried to carry forward in this chamber with other parties during the Brexit period. But, Presiding Officer, not only is this a bad deal, it is being pursued in a bad way. The presentation of a totally false choice to try and bludgeon MPs and others to support the Prime Minister is one sign of that. Another is the actions of the UK Government, which have sought to restrict the powers of this Parliament and which have already imposed upon us legislation against our will. This is not just a bad deal because it will damage our future relationship with Europe, but because it also creates the pretext for a continued unconstitutional assault on the rights and privileges of the people of Scotland as exercised through this Parliament. It is an attempt to unsettle the will of the Scottish people, whilst eroding the rights of and imperiling the future prosperity of everyone who lives in this country. So, Presiding Officer, what is being offered is unacceptable, and so is what is not being offered. This deal provides for a degree of differentiation in Northern Ireland which we fully support as essential to the future functioning of the Irish border and the protection of the Good Friday Agreement. We want that to happen. We will do everything we can to help it happen. And of course, whilst the deal provides for the whole of the UK to be within a customs union within the EU, thus rendering Liam Fox's job redundant at the stroke of the negotiator's pen, there will also, we understand, be specific provisions, including single market alignment provision, which will only apply to Northern Ireland. That will see a better level of access to the European market for Northern Ireland compared to other parts of the UK. We rejoice for Northern Ireland that this has been achieved, but we cannot accept it be achieved only for Northern Ireland. The Scottish Government has been arguing since December 2016 that if the UK leaves the single market, Scotland should remain. But in January 2017, within weeks of the publication of Scotland's Place in Europe, I was told to my face by David Davis in his own office in the House of Commons that differentiation could not work in these islands and would not be proposed by the UK government. But now Northern Ireland rightly is to receive that special status, yet we alone of the four nations will get nothing we voted for. England and Wales voted leave, and they will leave, even though polls now show that the majority in Wales is against, and much of England is moving that way. Northern Ireland will get a special deal. Even tiny Gibraltar, which was resolute in its need for continued special treatment, which we understood and supported, has been given that special treatment. But Scotland, with the highest Remain vote of any of the UK nations, is to be dragged out of the EU against our will, exposed to severe economic disadvantage and damage, have the powers of our Parliament diminished, and yet receive nothing at all. Enough, Presiding Officer, is enough. Throughout the long, tortuous process of engagement with the UK government, we have been repeatedly assured of the importance of our views. But those assurances have turned out to be worthless and hollow. So what, Presiding Officer, do we here in this Parliament do next? Well, firstly, we should go on working with others in Scotland, in the UK and across parties to ensure there is a better deal than the false choice offered by the UK government of this disastrous deal or no deal. An election, the people's vote, remain within that mix. We will also ensure that this Scottish Parliament has the right to give its own view on this deal. And I confirm today that the Scottish Government will bring the deal, if agreed at the Brussels Summit on November the 25th, to this chamber for a vote before the vote takes place in the House of Commons. And of course our motion will be amendable. That is how a proper Parliament should work. But as I said at the beginning of this statement, Presiding Officer, this is a sad day for those of us who believe and still believe in the importance of European cooperation. Those of us who reject the demonising of migration, the misrepresentation of cooperation, and the assertion of false claims regarding taking back control and the independence of the UK. Those of us, in other words, who still believe in a better future for our country. Of course, in one sense, we have been here before. The promises made from 2014, lead not leave, for example, have turned out to be worthless. We are not an equal partner, and the events of this week have proved it beyond peradventure. And I know that from each and every meeting of the JMC I have attended on behalf of this government. Far from leading the UK, the people of Scotland have been ignored and dismissed. Westminster has treated and goes on treating Scotland with contempt. But it does not have to be that way. It should not be that way. And I would consider it is the duty of every elected representative in this place to make sure it isn't allowed to be that way. We should understand that politicians are, if they are anything, people with a vision of a better future, motivated by a burning desire to help our fellow citizens achieve it. Brexit isn't a better future. It's a backward step into a false and imagined past. That is now crystal clear, and every word of this deal proves it to be true. Things in Brexit, Presiding Officer, for Scotland can only get worse. So we must acknowledge that this deal is unacceptable to Scotland and her citizens, and we must then find a way to work together to ensure that our country is not failed by a disastrous Tory Brexit, but enabled to flourish by choosing a different way forward.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions. Adam Tompkins, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This isn't a government statement from a serious minister. It's a cocktail of contrived grievance from someone who, even 2 years on, has never accommodated himself to the democratic will of the British people that we leave the European Union. Now, I voted Remain too, but the difference between Mike Russell and me is that I respect the result of referendums and he does not. Unlike some, I was not surprised by yesterday's events. I always thought that the Prime Minister would get a deal with Brussels. I have never advocated a no-deal Brexit, and I've never thought that that would be our fate. Presiding Officer, none of us knows whether yesterday's draft withdrawal agreement will survive intact. Getting a deal through a fractious House of Commons was always going to be more difficult than getting a deal with Brussels. And that task has not been made any easier by the sad and unnecessary cabinet resignations we have witnessed this morning. This deal is not perfect. It may or may not survive. And with regard to key elements of it, I myself would frankly reserve my judgment. What I do support, and this is what the Cabinet decided yesterday, is that it should now be subject to intense parliamentary and external scrutiny. So I don't rush to judgment, neither to celebrate every clause of its 85 pages, nor to condemn it out of hand, as the Minister just sought to do. Presiding Officer, I want to ask the Minister about differentiated deals. He wants a deal so differentiated that Scotland would remain in the European Single Market and Customs Union, even while the rest of Great Britain withdraws from both. Is it not the case that he wants that for the very reason that I am resolutely against it, namely that it would destroy the integrity of the United Kingdom, which Scotland voted to remain part of in 2014? Does the Minister not accept that the draft withdrawal agreement published yesterday contemplates nothing of this sort? Its detailed, lengthy and, yes, complex provisions on Northern Ireland are miles away from the SNP's disastrous proposals for an altogether different sort of Brexit.
Cabinet Secretary.
To address the substance of the question, no, I do not agree. It is quite obvious a reading of any of the documents indicates that there are huge similarities in terms of what is being proposed for Northern Ireland, and a negotiation that led to an implementation of some of the recommendations of Scotland's Place in Europe, which was published in December 2016, would allow for a sensible compromise. I think it's more likely that the precious union, I notice this word, the union has to have the word precious in front of it now for any Tory to talk about it, is more likely to be damaged in the long term and in extremist by the type of dogmatic approach that the Prime Minister has taken and the completely out-of-touch approach we've heard from Mr Tompkins. Because I believe that on those Tory benches, I know actually, on those Tory benches, there are people who know how ridiculous and appalling this situation is now. There are sensible people who would support a sensible way forward, who could not in any way support what they see happening at Westminster, where the Tory party is literally falling to pieces before our eyes. And I do hope that perhaps some of those people might eventually step forward and say, enough is enough. Because that is essentially what I think they should do as representatives of the Scottish people, rather than as Conservatives. That will be their choice. But I don't believe that the tone of Adam Tompkins' question does anything other than betray the fact that he may well be one of those people who knows how wrong this is.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Ross Greer. Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, in the last 24 hours, we've entered the end game in the 40-year-long civil war in the Tory party over Europe. 2.5 years after Brexit, the Brexit vote, we're presented with a withdrawal agreement that fails to meet the tests Labour set, and we will not support this bad deal. We've always put Scotland first in this, and this is not a deal that meets Scotland's needs, or indeed the needs of other nations and regions of the UK, and it fails to respect devolution. It does not meet our demand for a permanent customs union arrangement. It fails to set out the collaborative and cooperative future with the EU that we want to see. It fails to provide equal access to the single market or guarantee that will not fall behind in workers' rights, consumer protection and protection of our environment. This cannot be a choice between a bad deal and a disastrous no deal. And the Cabinet Secretary said he will bring forward a motion to this Parliament. Will he work with me and others to ensure that that motion gathers the widest possible parliamentary support? He spoke of a differentiated border and customs arrangement for Scotland, and the First Minister has spoken about that too. Can I ask what work has been done in this? How will it work? What the impact would be? And will he publish the government's plans today? And in relation to Northern Ireland, it is a land border with the EU. We don't. It has a history of conflict. It is the Good Friday Agreement and the will of the people holding the peace. The circumstances there are completely different to Scotland, and nothing must undermine that peace. So does the Cabinet Secretary believe that creating a hard border between Scotland and our biggest market, the rest of the UK, would be in Scotland's interest? And finally, will he do now what the First Minister failed to do at question time, and that is call for an immediate general election so we can rid the country of this shambolic and arrogant Tory government?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the First Minister was very clear about that. I mean, quite clearly, there are a range of options on the table, and the general election is one of those options. And, you know, if a general election takes place, I will be quite happy to campaign alongside my SNP colleagues, who will undoubtedly be taking seats from both of these parties. But, however, let's see if we can address some of those. First of all, on the question of publishing material, we published Scotland's Place in Europe in December 2016. It contains all that information. Absolutely contains all that information. And indeed, we have gone on publishing other volumes called Scotland's Place in Europe, almost like a serial publication from the 19th century. I'm happy to go on doing so. That information is there. It is in the public domain. To move then in terms to Northern Ireland, of course, I entirely agree that peace is the absolute most important thing. And I indicated in my statement, of course I did. But there are similarities in what could be done in terms of differentiation, which would benefit both sides. And that is what we are talking about, and that's what we want to put in place. And it does not include a hard border. Indeed, the whole purpose of the Northern Irish situation is not to have a hard border. Now, let's go to what we could actually bring us together on. I am happy to commit myself to work with Mr Finlay on the details of a motion to bring to this chamber and to ensure it has the widest possible support. I say that to everybody in this chamber, Mr Finlay, myself. I'm sure that the Greens will want to do so. I'm sure the Liberals will want to do so. And, you know, there is no joy in heaven greater than that of a sinner that repenteth. If the Tories wanted to take part in that, to produce an effective motion that showed that this Parliament would speak for Scotland against Brexit, then I'd welcome too. But as Mr Finlay has indicated, I won't get my hopes up for that actually happening. So as far as I'm concerned, we will take this forward as the parties in the House of Commons are. Because I pointed out that Jeremy Corbyn and Vince Cable have signed with Ian Blackford, with Plaid and with the Greens a letter about what would take place, they hope to take place in the meaningful vote. And I continue to work very closely, and I want to make this point, with my colleague Mark Drakeford on these issues, and both of us were at the JMC on Tuesday, where, as usual, we received no illumination of any description.
Ross Greer to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's statement today, and the Greens would, of course, be more than happy to work with the Labour Party and the Scottish Government to try and present as close as possible to a united voice from this Parliament on behalf of Scotland. Now, I understand the Scottish Government's previous reticence to give momentum to a no-deal scenario by publishing material on their preparations for it, but we're well past that point now. No deal is a very real threat now that the deal on the table, as the Minister has said, is almost certainly set to fall in the House of Commons. We still believe there are other options. We look forward to a ruling from the ECJ later this month or early next month on whether Article 50 can be revoked. But the Westminster Health Secretary apparently told the Cabinet last night he couldn't guarantee that people wouldn't die as a result of a no deal, given the near inevitability of medicine and other shortages. Given the serious and mounting concerns and the clear impact on areas of devolved responsibility, will the Scottish Government now publish in full its no deal preparatory work?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you for that question. I actually think the events of the last 24 hours have actually made no deal much less likely than it was. I think that it has concentrated minds. I think some of the work of people like the Health Secretary in England has been designed to egg this up, and in so doing have actually made it clear to almost everybody that it shouldn't happen. However, we are not going to let up on our own preparations. A very substantial amount of my time over the last period has been spent on no-deal issues. I expect to be in a position to come to this chamber with more information on that before Christmas, and I make an undertaking to do so, and I hope that will include publication of some information. But again, Ross Greer makes a very important point. We have to have a very careful judgment between whether we are egging that on and encouraging that and making people think it will happen, or whether we're actually providing reassurance. And I will always consider that to be the most important judgment. But I do give an undertaking that we will say more about this.
Tavish Scott to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Deputy Political Editor of the BBC has just tweeted that Tory Minister tells me if Brexiteers vote down the deal, he and others will openly campaign for a second referendum and to stay in the EU. Given the changing position of public opinion that Mr Russell mentioned in his remarks, both in Wales and in parts of England, London, of course, voted to remain, will he get behind that cross-party growing momentum for a people's vote and endorse it here today?
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, I have to say that I am behind it, remain behind it, and will be behind it, because that is the position that the SNP has taken. I mean, clearly, Tavish Scott and his colleague can't take yes for an answer. because they just don't want to take yes for an answer. We support the People's Vote campaign. That is clear. That is on the record. Now, you know, I hope in those circumstances that if that is one of the options that comes through this process and comes through the meaningful vote option, they will find that the SNP will support it. You may not wish us to do so, because clearly you're much happier, the Liberal Democrats are much happier, Presiding Officer, constantly asking the question, but I'll go on giving the same answer. Yes, we're behind it. We'll go on being behind it. It may well happen.
Thank you. There's considerable interest in this subject, as members can imagine. At least 10 members wish to get in. I would urge everyone to be succinct. However, having said that, I am prepared to let the statement run on a little bit, which will have an impact on the afternoon's debate. Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A very short quote. There's undoubtedly a need for the devolved administrations to work with the UK Government to ensure we get a deal that reflects the needs of us all. Chiefly amongst this, our continued access to the single market. Protecting our trade with the EU will boost our economy, sustain jobs and help to fund vital public services. Not the words of the First Minister, not the words of the Cabinet Secretary, not even my words, but the words of the Tory leader, Ruth Davidson. Cabinet Secretary, I am the first to recognise that the circumstances of the Northern Ireland are different to those in Scotland. However, is it still not an entirely legitimate question to ask? If the single market access is good enough for Northern Ireland, why is it not good enough for Scotland? And do you agree with Ruth Davidson's comments? And what common cause can you have with these pragmatic and sensible Tories you think that exist in this chamber, as well as other parties, to fight for Scotland's interests?
Cabinet Secretary.
My friend Mr Crawford makes a very good and sound point, and of course we could extend it backwards in time to the role of Margaret Thatcher as essentially the key midwife for the single market coming into being, and her enthusiastic view of the single market. Now, the single market has developed and changed, and it has brought in more acceptable issues in terms of how employment and other conditions. But it is something that was and should be valued across this chamber. And what we've actually seen is this very strange set of circumstances where people who supported it and who knew that leaving the single market would be immensely damaging have been persuaded by the wind blowing from their party in Westminster to do a complete volte-face and to pretend that in many ways it doesn't matter. That is simply not true. It matters enormously, particularly, as I indicated in my statement, in freedom of movement. It is vital for the health of the Scottish economy and for rural Scotland most of all. And I shall be speaking tomorrow at the Scottish Rural Parliament in Stranraer and making that point. So I keep hoping that sense will prevail in the Scottish Tory party, forlorn hope perhaps, and that they will recognise that the stance they're taking may help for a very brief period of time Theresa May, but it will damage the people they're meant to represent.
Donald Cameron, to be followed by Alex Neil.
Thank you. Whereas the Scottish Conservatives publicly sought assurances from the Prime Minister yesterday that the draft deal protects Scotland's fishing interests, isn't it the case that the Scottish Government's position is to take Scotland straight back into the common fisheries policy, and accordingly any betrayal of our fishing interests lies at the door of the SNP?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I like and respect Donald Cameron, and that question is not worthy of him, because the reality of this situation, is this. The Conservative Party have been the enthusiastic supporters and implementers of the Common Fisheries Policy since it started. The Scottish National Party has argued and will continue to argue for either, and I think I use the words of the manifesto, to scrap or radically reform the Common Fisheries Policy. There has been a cruel hoax perpetrated on the fishing community in Scotland by the Scottish Conservatives. Yesterday's part of that was a piece of theatre to which they knew the answer, even though that answer was false. Because there is no doubt, reading the documents, that the long, years-long betrayal of the Scottish fishing industry will continue. And I hope Mr Cameron, on reflection, will realise that what he has said adds again to that betrayal.
Alec Neil, to be followed by Claire Baker. Alec Neil.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Can I, as someone who voted for Brexit, agree with the Cabinet Secretary that the draft withdrawal agreement is totally unacceptable? It is neither fish nor fowl. It's not in the EU and it's not out of the EU. And there is much wrong with this draft agreement, but none more so, despite what Donald Cameron says, than another Tory sellout in relation to the future of our fishing industry and our fishing communities, putting at risk again one of the most important industries in rural Scotland. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when you actually read the document published last night, which obviously Donald Cameron has not, it is very clear. Not only is there no deal on
Question,
fishing,
Mr. Neil, please.
there is no guarantee that the fishing industry will not be in the common fisheries policy. And does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me? If the Scottish Tories fail to deliver, every one of their MPs should have a moral responsibility to resign their seats if they do in the Scottish fishing industry for the second time. First time being Ted Teeth, second time being Theresa May.
Cabinet Secretary.
I want to make two, and I know time is short, I want to make two quick points about fishing. The first one is I agree that, of course, the 13 Scottish Conservatives should resign, but they're taking their lead, no doubt, from David Mundell, who clearly doesn't want to resign no matter what he promises. So I can't do anything other than say that would be the honourable thing for them to do. But let me just make a key point about fishing. I represent a number of fishing communities in Argyll and Bute. They're very different from the interests of fishing that are claimed elsewhere. The worry in Argyll and Bute amongst many fishermen is access to markets. There's access to markets for shellfish, for example. The proposals that Theresa May has on the table do not provide frictionless trade. They create circumstances in which that market access will become ever more difficult. Those are people whose livelihoods are directly threatened by what the Prime Minister is proposing. Those are fishermen and fisherwomen in Scotland who will look at this deal and realise that they are getting nothing, zilch, nada, from the Scottish Conservatives and the Conservatives south of the border.
Claire Baker, to be followed by June McAlpine.
Thank you. The Government's focus today is on arguing for a special deal, but the reality is, following the developments we've seen throughout today, the deal we are deliberating over is on the verge of collapse. But the deal before us does set out a differentiation for Northern Ireland. Is the Cabinet Secretary confident that all of the proposals in Scotland's place in Europe on an open border with England, who, unlike Ireland, would be outside of the EU, are still workable, given the detail of the draft proposal for Northern Ireland?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am absolutely convinced that you can find, and it would be easy to find, a workable solution to these matters. Those are matters which can be resolved, and differentiation is vitally important in terms of access, particularly to labour. And the member will know, for the region that she represents, that there are many industries and many sectors which are already experiencing shortage of labour. And that can only get worse. And in addition, there's substantial difficulties in terms of wage inflation because workers cannot be found. Now, in those circumstances, getting the right deal for Scotland would be actually not to leave the EU, but if a deal can be found in those circumstances, it can be found to work for Northern Ireland and for Scotland.
June McAlpine, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much. In this deal, Northern Ireland, which voted Remain, is guaranteed a special deal to stay close to the EU. So where does the Cabinet Secretary see this leaving Scotland, which, despite having had the highest Remain vote of any UK nation, is being left high and dry with our democratic voice ignored?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would simply go back to the account of the conversation I gave with David Davis. There was a root and branch refusal to accept differentiation at the beginning of this process. When that became essential for Northern Ireland, there was a view from the Prime Minister, I suspect, because she controls everything or tries to control everything, there was a view from the Prime Minister that no ground should be given to Scotland. We know, in terms of the briefings that we now understood took place to say to the EU that nothing must be drafted that would assist Scotland, that there was essentially a negative, dog-in-the-manger attitude from the Prime Minister that's affected this. We continue to argue that another way is possible, and we will go on arguing that.
Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
The draft agreement appears to offer no guarantees on the future ability of the UK to be involved in European reference networks, which allow knowledge and expertise about rare diseases and work on treatment and cures to be shared across Europe. Now, I appreciate the many issues the Cabinet Secretary is wrestling with, But will he offer his support for the Genetic Alliance campaign to protect involvement in ERNs and undertake to raise this matter with the UK Government, given that for many people this could literally be a matter of life or death?
Cabinet Secretary. The member makes a very good point. It is one of the issues which causes enormous concern, and of course there are many of them. If the member would like to write to me or come and see me and give me that information, perhaps with the organisation, I've seen the outline information, I will undertake to take it forward. On a general point, there are whole areas in this where, although issues may be referred to in passing, nothing is tied down. And the process of tying down this material and information will take years. The real problem that we now face, if anything like the Prime Minister's deal were to go forward, is that we would then be faced with an implementation period that would have to be renewed, and at any time during that we could see a collapse in talks, but also we will be in that limbo for a long period of time. None of that is necessary if we took a single market and customs union approach.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In December 2016, Michael Russell stated that membership of the single market is, and I quote, clearly not going to happen. What's changed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member would have to remind me of the exact context of that. Unlike Mr. Kerr, I don't go and try and scrape through my previous speeches trying to quote me out of context. Membership of the single market and customs union is essential. It is absolutely essential. We have said so. We have said so from the beginning, and we have had the backing of the Scottish Conservatives. We've had the backing of Ruth Davidson. We've had the backing even of Adam Tompkins in that matter. So in all those circumstances, I say today, as I have said last year and will continue to say, we need to be in the single market. That is it.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What's been announced is an agreement on the UK's withdrawal from the EU. The long-term relationship is yet to be agreed. Indeed, the political declaration detailing this is only 7 pages long and provides no firm commitments to the nature of the future economic relationship. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the risk of a blind Brexit is now a very real one?
Cabinet Secretary.
It is true that the blindfold aspect of this, which has been much discussed in recent months, has not diminished. There is an expectation that we might see more of the political declaration next week, but of course the political declaration is not legally binding. The exit agreement would be legally binding. The political declaration is aspirational, and then you have the immensely detailed negotiations that have to build upon that to get the final relationship. That will take a great deal of time. I think we will know more when we see the full political declaration, but I think there will be aspects of this if it were to go ahead in the way that Theresa May wants it to go ahead, and I think that's highly unlikely given where the House of Commons has shown itself to be today. But if they were to go ahead, then there would be whole areas of which we knew absolutely nothing, and we would have no purchase and no heft in negotiations.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Given the many references in the statement to special status for Northern Ireland, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the focus should really be the permanent membership of the Customs Union, because that protects the interests of all 4 nations and also protects the peace agreement in Northern Ireland? But importantly, it allows Scotland and the interests of all the other nations, including Northern Ireland's economies and interests, to be equally protected.
I agree with the member that an agreement from the UK to stay permanently in the customs union would be a big step forward. It would not, in my view, give us enough in terms of the single market issues, but of course the single market can build upon a customs union, and if there was an intention to do so, that would also be a step forward. Of course, we don't have anything like that at the present moment. So I am preparing myself for all sorts of eventualities, but one of them has to be to say that if this were to happen and that Northern Ireland were in that position, then Scotland would have to be in the same position as Northern Ireland in order, for 2 reasons. One is because we would find it necessary, but the second reason is it would be very difficult for us to compete with Northern Ireland. For example, in terms of European investment, in terms of European workers, we would simply not have a level playing field. But I agree with her, the best solution of all is for the whole of these islands to stay in the EU. That would be a much, much more sensible decision. Bending that, then the decision you move from that, you need to move as little as possible from that, and staying permanent in the customs union is not as bad as some of the things that Theresa May is proposing.
Annabel Ewing.
Presiding Officer, no mention of Scotland in the 585-page Brexit document, no briefing for the Scottish Government. What happened to the 2014 treaty, lead us, don't leave us? Cabinet Secretary, is it not just the case that the so-called respect agenda simply does not exist?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member is correct. I made that point in my statement. I think it is a sham, a complete sham now. And I noticed when she was asking a question, there were mutterings from the Scottish Conservative front bench. They don't want to confront the reality of this, that the arguments that they put forward in 2014 turn out to be completely and utterly untrue. They were, in other words, Presiding Officer, a lie.
I'd urge caution about using such language in this chamber.